The sound of a hand striking flesh echoed through the crowded marketplace, and every single person froze where they stood. Eleanor's heart could not remember deciding to move. One moment she was carrying a folded coat to a customer, and the next moment her palm was stinging, and Lord Edmund Blackwood was staring at her with wide, furious eyes, one hand pressed against his reddened cheek. A boy lay curled on the cobblestones behind him, arms wrapped around his ribs, silent tears cutting clean lines through the dirt on his face. Nobody in the market moved, nobody breathed. A cart wheel creaked somewhere in the distance, the only sound brave enough to break the silence. Eleanor had seen the whole thing happen in the space of 3 heartbeats. The servant boy, thin as a reed and dressed in rags too big for his small frame, had been carrying a tray of wine cups across the square when his foot caught on a loose stone. The tray tipped. Red wine splashed across the polished boots of a nobleman who had just stepped out of his carriage. The boy had barely opened his mouth to apologize before the nobleman's boot connected with his side, once, twice, hard enough that the boy folded in on himself with a sound that was more air than voice. Eleanor had not thought about consequences. She had not thought about her position, her safety, or the laws that protected men like Lord Blackwood and left boys like this one unprotected. She had thought only of the sound the boy made, small and broken, and before she understood what her own body was doing, she had crossed the square and slapped a nobleman across the face in front of half the city. "Do you know who I am?" Lord Blackwood's voice cracked with disbelief before it hardened into rage. His hand was still pressed to his cheek, and color was rising up his neck like a flame catching dry wood. "I know what you did," Eleanor said. Her voice trembled, but she did not step back. "He is a child, he tripped. That is not a reason to hurt him." A murmur rippled through the crowd, the kind of sound people make when they agree with something but are too frightened to say it out loud. Market women pulled their children closer. Merchants suddenly found urgent reasons to examine their own stalls. Nobody wanted to be seen taking a side, because everyone understood what came next. "Guards!" Lord Blackwood's shout rang across the square, sharp and shaking with wounded pride. "Seize this woman!" 2 city guards who had been standing near the fountain, half asleep in the afternoon sun, snapped to attention and began pushing through the crowd. Eleanor felt her heart slam against her ribs, but she did not run. Running would only make things worse, and besides, some stubborn part of her refused to be ashamed of what she had done. The servant boy, still curled on the ground, looked up at her through a curtain of matted hair. His eyes were an unusual shade of gray-green, striking against the grime on his face, and for a strange moment Eleanor felt as though she were being studied rather than simply looked at. Around his thin neck, half hidden beneath his ragged collar, something small and metallic caught the afternoon light. "Are you hurt badly?" she asked him quietly, crouching despite the guards closing in. The boy shook his head, though his hand stayed pressed to his ribs. "You should not have done that," he whispered. "He will hurt you now instead." "Someone had to," Eleanor said simply, and she meant it. The guards reached her a moment later, rough hands closing around her arms. She did not fight them, though every instinct screamed at her to pull away. Lord Blackwood watched with a thin, satisfied smile creeping across his face, the kind of smile worn by a man who believes the world will always bend in his favor. "Take her to the holding cells," he said, straightening his coat with exaggerated dignity. "Let the magistrate decide what is done with a commoner who dares to strike a nobleman in public." As the guards began pulling her away, Eleanor twisted her head back toward the boy one last time. He had pushed himself up onto his knees, and though his face was still pale with pain, his eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that seemed far too old for a child his age. "Thank you," he mouthed, so quietly she almost missed it. Eleanor did not know, as the guards marched her through the narrow streets toward the city holding cells, that the boy she had just defended was not simply a servant. She did not know that his real name was not the one scrawled onto a kitchen ledger somewhere in Lord Blackwood's household. She did not know that far across the city, inside the tall gray walls of a ducal estate, an old man had spent 7 long years searching for a child with those exact gray-green eyes. She only knew that she had done the right thing, and that doing the right thing was about to cost her everything. The holding cell was cold and smelled of damp stone. Eleanor sat on the narrow wooden bench, her wrists still marked from where the rope had bound them during the walk across the city. Through the small barred window near the ceiling, she could see a thin strip of darkening sky, the color slowly shifting from gray to a deep, bruised purple as evening settled over the city. She thought about her mother, who had raised her alone after her father died in a shipyard accident, and who had always told her that kindness was a debt owed to the world, not a favor done for others. She thought about the seamstress shop where she worked, and wondered if her employer would still have a place for her when this was over, if there even was an over waiting for her. Mostly, though, she thought about the boy's eyes. There had been something in them that did not match his ragged clothes or his bruised ribs, something watchful and quietly intelligent, as though he were carrying a secret too heavy for a child to hold alone. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside her cell, slow and deliberate, unlike the hurried pace of the guards who had brought her in. Eleanor sat up straighter, her heart beginning to pound. The footsteps stopped just outside the bars, and a figure stepped into the dim light of the single hanging lantern. He was an old man, tall despite a slight stoop in his shoulders, dressed in a plain gray cloak that gave no hint of wealth or status, though something in the way he carried himself suggested both. His hair was silver, cropped close, and his face was lined with the kind of exhaustion that comes not from a single hard day but from years of quiet, unrelenting worry. His eyes, when they found hers through the bars, were sharp and searching. "You are the woman who struck Lord Blackwood in the market square today," he said. It was not a question. Eleanor lifted her chin, refusing to let her fear show. "I am." "Tell me what you saw," the old man said, and though his voice was calm, there was an urgency beneath it that made Eleanor pause before answering. "A boy fell and spilled wine on a nobleman's boots," she said slowly. "The nobleman kicked him, more than once. The boy had done nothing wrong except stumble." The old man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Describe the boy to me." Eleanor frowned, uncertain why a stranger would care so much about the details of a servant boy she had never met before that afternoon. But something about the man's manner, the barely restrained tension in his shoulders, told her this was not idle curiosity. "Thin," she said. "Small for his age, maybe 8 or 9 years old, though it was hard to tell beneath all the dirt and the ragged clothes. Gray-green eyes, unusually pale. Dark hair that needed washing badly. He wore something around his neck, a small pendant, though I could not see it clearly." The old man went very still. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and Eleanor watched something complicated move across his weathered face. Hope and fear tangled together so tightly that neither seemed able to win out over the other. "What was the shape of the pendant?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I only caught a glimpse," Eleanor admitted. "It looked like a bird perhaps, wings spread. I am sorry I cannot be more certain." The old man closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, they were wet with unshed tears he was clearly fighting to hold back. He pressed one hand against the stone wall beside the cell door as though he needed the support. "Who are you?" Eleanor asked softly, unable to hold back the question any longer. The old man studied her for a long moment before answering, as though weighing how much to reveal to a stranger locked behind iron bars. "My name is Henry Ashcombe," he said. "I am the Duke of this province, and I believe, though I dare not yet allow myself to hope too fully, that the boy you defended today may be my son, who was stolen from my household 7 years ago and never found." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Of all the things she had imagined might happen after her arrest, this had not been among them. She thought of the boy's watchful eyes, the strange dignity in the way he had thanked her despite his pain, and suddenly a great many small details seemed to shift into a different, startling shape. "I do not understand," she said. "If he is your son, why is he a servant in Lord Blackwood's household?" "That," Duke Ashcombe said grimly, "is precisely what I intend to find out. And you, young woman, without knowing it, may have just saved the life of the heir to this entire province." Outside the small barred window, the last light of day faded completely, and somewhere across the city, inside a grand house with polished floors and cold hearts, a boy who was more important than anyone in that house realized lay curled on a narrow cot, touching the small pendant at his throat and wondering, for the first time in years, whether someone might finally be looking for him. The candle beside Aliner's cell door had burned low by the time the Duke spoke again, his voice quieter now, heavier with the weight of memory. 7 years ago, he said, my household was struck by men who came in the night disguised as merchants seeking shelter from a storm. They were not merchants. By morning, 3 of my guards were wounded, my wife was inconsolable, and my infant son was gone. We searched every road, every port, every hidden corner of this province and beyond it. We found nothing. Eventually, most of my advisors urged me to accept that he was dead, to name a new heir and move forward, as a duke is expected to do. But you never accepted it, Aliner said quietly. I could not, Henry Ashcombe admitted. A father knows, somewhere beneath reason and evidence, whether his child is truly gone. I never felt that certainty. So I kept searching, quietly, without hope of reward, paying men to look in places official searches would never think to check. I had almost given up believing I would live long enough to find an answer. Aliner thought of the boy's pale eyes again, the strange watchfulness in them, the small pendant shaped like a bird with spread wings. The pendant, she said. It must mean something specific to your family. It is a mark carried only by those born into the Ashcombe bloodline, the Duke confirmed. A birthmark, shaped exactly as you described, is meant to appear on the inside of the left wrist of every true heir. It has appeared this way for 6 generations. If the boy carries that mark as well as the pendant, then there can be no doubt remaining. A guard's footsteps sounded from the far end of the corridor, and the Duke straightened quickly, his expression shifting back into the careful neutrality of a man accustomed to hiding his feelings in public. I must go, he said. I need to see this boy myself before I allow myself to believe anything further, but you, Aliner Hart, will not spend another night in this cell. I give you my word. How do you know my name? Aliner asked, startled. A faint, tired smile touched the corner of the Duke's mouth. I made it my business to learn it the moment I heard what you did in that market square. A woman brave enough to strike a nobleman in defense of a servant boy is not someone whose name I intend to forget. He turned to leave, but paused once more at the cell door, looking back at her with an expression that seemed to carry both gratitude and something like wonder. Whatever happens next, he said, know that today you did something very few people in this city would have dared to do. Whether or not that boy turns out to be my son, you protected a child who had no one else willing to stand up for him. That matters, regardless of his birth. Aliner swallowed hard, unexpectedly moved by his words. I only did what was right, she said again, though this time her voice wavered slightly. Sometimes, the Duke said softly, that is the hardest thing in the world to do. He disappeared down the corridor, his footsteps fading into the darkness, leaving Aliner alone once more with her thoughts and the cold stone walls pressing in around her. But something had shifted in the air of that cell, some small, fragile thread of hope where before there had been only fear. She thought of the boy again, of his ribs bruised beneath his ragged shirt, of the terrible casual cruelty with which Lord Blackwood had struck him down for something as small as an accident. She thought of the years that boy might have spent believing himself forgotten, unwanted, invisible to the world, when in truth an entire province had been waiting, searching, hoping for his return. Whatever happened next, Aliner understood that her life had changed course the moment her hand met Lord Blackwood's cheek in that crowded square. She could not have known, in that single reckless heartbeat of anger and protectiveness, that she had set into motion events that would upend an entire noble house, expose a nobleman's cruelty to the light, and reunite a father with the son he had never stopped searching for. She only knew, sitting alone in the dark, that she did not regret it, not for a single moment. Across the city, inside Lord Blackwood's grand house, the boy the world knew only as a nameless servant lay awake on his narrow cot, staring up at the cracked ceiling above him. His ribs ached where the boot had struck him, but the pain felt distant somehow, muffled beneath a strange, growing feeling he could not quite name. For years he had learned to expect nothing from the world except more of the same. Cold floors to scrub, harsh words for small mistakes, meals that came late or not at all. He had trained himself not to hope, because hoping only made the disappointment sharper when it inevitably came. But today, a stranger with fierce eyes had crossed a crowded square without hesitation and struck a nobleman to protect him. Nobody had ever done that before. Nobody had ever looked at him and decided he was worth that kind of risk. He touched the small pendant hanging against his chest, worn smooth by years of anxious fingers running over its edges. His mother, whoever she truly was, had left it with him, though he had no memory of her face or her voice, only a vague, fading sense of warmth from a time so long ago it barely felt real anymore. Somewhere in this city, he thought, closing his eyes against the ache in his ribs, there might be people who were still looking for him. He did not dare believe it fully, but for the first time in longer than he could remember, he allowed himself to wonder. And far across the darkened streets, in a stone cell lit by a single guttering candle, Heir Hart wondered the very same thing, though neither of them yet understood how deeply their fates had already become entwined, nor how much both their lives were about to change with the rising of the next sun. Morning came slowly to the city, gray light creeping through the small barred window of Heir's cell like water seeping under a locked door. She had not slept, though she had tried, curling on the narrow bench with her arms wrapped around her knees while the cold seeped into her bones. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the boy's face again, the way his gray-green eyes had watched her with a stillness that seemed impossible for someone so young. The sound of the outer door opening jolted her upright. Footsteps approached, brisker this time, accompanied by the jingle of keys. She expected a guard bringing thin porridge or perhaps summoning her to face the magistrate. Instead, the cell door swung open, and a woman in a plain traveling cloak stepped inside, her face kind but businesslike. "Miss Hart," the woman said, "I am Margaret Wren, steward to the Duke's household. You are to come with me. His Grace has arranged for your release." Heir rose stiffly, her legs unsteady after a night on the cold bench. "Release," she repeated, hardly daring to believe it, just like that. "The Duke does not make promises lightly," Margaret said, already turning toward the corridor. "Come, there is much to do, and time is not a luxury we have in abundance today." Outside, the morning air was crisp and smelled of baking bread from a nearby shop, an ordinary smell that felt strangely miraculous after a night spent imagining far worse fates. A plain carriage waited at the curb, unmarked by any crest, which Heir understood immediately was intentional. Whatever the Duke was doing, he was doing it quietly, away from the prying eyes of the city. "Where are we going?" Heir asked as the carriage lurched into motion. "To the Duke's private residence outside the city walls," Margaret answered. "He wishes to speak with you further, and there is someone else he would like you to see." Heir's heart quickened. "The boy, is he safe?" Margaret's expression softened, just slightly. "He is being examined by the household physician as we speak. His Grace insisted on absolute discretion. If word spreads too soon that the Duke suspects his missing son has been found, certain parties may act to hide the truth permanently. Or worse, remove the boy from the city altogether before the matter can be settled." The carriage rattled through streets that gradually grew quieter and greener, the crowded market stalls giving way to wide avenues lined with old oak trees, and finally to iron gates set into a high stone wall. Heir had never seen the Duke's estate up close before, only heard stories of its grandeur from customers who came into the seamstress shop boasting of invitations they had received to grand functions there. The house itself was less imposing than she had expected, elegant but not overly ornate, built from pale gray stone softened by climbing ivy along its western wall. Margaret led her briskly through a side entrance, down a long corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and finally into a bright, book-lined study where Duke Ashcombe waited, pacing before a cold hearth. He looked, Heir thought, as though he had not slept either. Deep shadows ringed his eyes, but there was an energy in his movements that had not been present the night before, something taut and electric, as though he were holding himself together through sheer force of will. "Miss Hart," he said, turning as she entered. "Thank you for coming." "I did not think I had much choice in the matter," Eleanor said, though not unkindly, "given that I was still technically imprisoned an hour ago." A faint, weary smile crossed the Duke's face. "Fair enough. Please sit. There is a great deal to discuss, and I would rather you hear it from me directly than through rumor and speculation." Eleanor sat in the chair he indicated, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "Is it true? Is the boy truly your son?" The Duke's jaw tightened, and for a moment he did not answer, staring instead at the empty hearth as though gathering the courage to speak. "The birthmark is present," he said finally, his voice thick with an emotion he was clearly struggling to contain. "Exactly where it should be, exactly as it has appeared in every generation of my family for 6 generations before this one. The physician confirmed it not an hour ago." Eleanor felt her own eyes sting unexpectedly. "Then it is true, he is your son." "I believe so," the Duke said, "though I have learned over 7 years of chasing false hope to be cautious even now. But yes, everything I have seen this morning points toward the truth I have prayed for every single day since he vanished." A quiet knock sounded at the study door, and Margaret Wren stepped inside, her expression carefully composed. "Your Grace, the boy is asking for the woman from the market square. He is refusing to eat until he sees her." Something in Eleanor's chest tightened at those words, an unexpected surge of protectiveness she had not fully processed until that moment. "May I see him?" she asked, already rising from her chair. The Duke nodded, gesturing for her to follow Margaret. "Please. He trusts almost no one in this house yet, understandably. If he trusts you, I would consider it a great kindness if you would stay near him for now, until he grows more comfortable." They found the boy in a bright room on the eastern side of the house, sitting upright in a bed far too large, and soft for someone who had likely spent years sleeping on thin, hard cots. He had been washed and dressed in a simple linen shirt, and without the layer of grime that had covered him in the market square, Eleanor could see more clearly the resemblance to the tired, hopeful man in the study downstairs. The same set to the jaw, the same watchful intensity in the eyes. "You came," the boy said, relief flooding his face the moment he saw her. "Of course I came," Eleanor said gently, crossing the room to sit in the chair beside his bed. "How are your ribs feeling this morning?" "Better," he said, though he winced slightly as he shifted position, betraying the lie. "They gave me medicine and food, more food than I have seen in a very long time." "You should eat it," Eleanor said, "all of it. You need your strength." The boy studied her for a long moment, his gray-green eyes searching her face with that same unnerving intensity she remembered from the market square. "They are saying I am the Duke's son," he said quietly, "that I am not who I thought I was at all." Eleanor chose her words carefully, aware of how fragile this moment felt, how much weight rested on it for a child who had spent years believing himself unwanted. "What do you think about that?" The boy was silent for a long moment, staring down at his own hands as though they might hold an answer. "I do not know," he admitted finally. "I do not remember being anyone's son. I only remember scrubbing floors and being told I was fortunate to have a place to sleep at all." "That was a lie," Eleanor said firmly. "Whoever told you that lied to you. You deserved far better than what you were given, long before anyone knew whose son you truly were." Something in the boy's expression shifted, a small crack appearing in the careful, guarded composure he had clearly built up over years of survival. "My name," he said softly. "Do you know what my real name is?" "I do not," Eleanor admitted. "But I imagine the Duke does, and I think he would be very glad to tell you if you are ready to hear it." The boy nodded slowly, and for the first time since Eleanor had met him, something like a genuine smile touched the corner of his mouth, small and uncertain but real. "Will you stay?" he asked. "While he tells me." "For as long as you need me to," Eleanor promised, and she meant every word of it. Downstairs in his study, Duke Ashcombe stood at the window overlooking the gardens, watching the morning sun climb higher over the trees. 7 years of searching, 7 years of grief carefully hidden behind the duties of governing a province, 7 years of a wound that had never fully closed, and now, impossibly, a path forward had opened before him. But he understood better than anyone that the discovery of his son was only the beginning of the difficulties ahead. Lord Blackwood would not surrender a valuable servant, even an unknowing heir, without a fight. There were questions that needed answering. How had the boy come into Blackwood's household in the first place? Who had taken him from the estate 7 years ago, and why had he ended up, of all places, serving wine in the home of a minor nobleman only a few miles from where he had been born? And there was still the matter of Heir Hart, sitting in a chair beside his son's bed at that very moment, a woman who had risked imprisonment, perhaps worse, to defend a child she had never met before that afternoon. The Duke was not a man given to sentimentality, but he found himself deeply moved by her courage, and increasingly certain that whatever came next, she deserved to be part of it. He turned from the window as Margaret Wren entered the study once more, her expression grave. "Your Grace," she said, "word has reached Lord Blackwood's household that the servant boy was taken in for examination by your physician. He has sent a messenger demanding the boy's immediate return, along with a formal complaint regarding Miss Hart's assault upon his person yesterday." The Duke's expression hardened into something cold and determined, a look Margaret had not seen on his face in a very long time. "Then it seems," he said quietly, "that Lord Blackwood is about to discover precisely how much trouble a nobleman can find himself in when he mistreats a child he never bothered to properly identify." Margaret allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. "Shall I prepare a response, Your Grace?" "Prepare a summons," the Duke said. "I want Lord Blackwood standing before the city magistrate within the week, and I want every detail of how that boy came into his household laid bare before witnesses. If there is cruelty in his past dealings, and I suspect there is a great deal of it, I intend for the entire city to know precisely who Lord Edmund Blackwood truly is." Outside, the morning sun climbed higher still, warming the stone walls of the estate and the quiet garden below, where for the first time in 7 years, hope had finally found its way back into Duke Henry Ashcombe's household. The days that followed passed in a strange blur for Heir, caught somewhere between the quiet comfort of the Duke's estate and the growing storm gathering beyond its walls. She had been given a small guest room near the boy's chamber, and though she insisted she needed to return to her work at the seamstress shop, Duke Ashcombe gently but firmly requested that she remain a while longer, at least until matters with Lord Blackwood had been settled. The boy, she learned, was to be called by his given name once more, a name recorded carefully in the estate's private records 7 years earlier. Edwin. It suited him, Heir thought, watching him slowly grow more comfortable in his new surroundings, testing the boundaries of a life he had never imagined possible. He still flinched at sudden movements. He still ate quickly, almost fearfully, as though the food might be taken away before he finished. But each day, small pieces of the frightened, guarded child began to soften, replaced by glimpses of curiosity and quiet laughter that Heir suspected had been buried deep beneath years of hardship. "He asks for you constantly," Margaret Wren told her one afternoon, finding Heir in the garden where she had taken to sitting each morning, watching the household staff move about their duties. "The Duke has noticed as well. He is grateful, more than I think he knows how to properly express." "I only wish to see him safe," Heir said honestly. "None of the rest matters to me." Margaret studied her for a moment, an odd, considering look on her face. "You should know," she said carefully, "that investigators sent by the Duke have uncovered troubling information regarding how Edwin came into Lord Blackwood's household. It seems the truth is considerably worse than any of us first suspected." Heir's stomach tightened. "Worse how?" "There are records," Margaret said, lowering her voice though they were alone in the garden, "suggesting Lord Blackwood purchased Edwin, along with several other children, from a broker operating along the eastern docks. A man who dealt in children stolen or sold from families too poor or too desperate to prevent it. Lord Blackwood claims he believed the children were simply orphans in need of placement, but the investigators found payment records that suggest otherwise. He knew, or at the very least, he never bothered to ask the questions that might have revealed the truth. Eleanor felt sick, thinking of Edwin's flinching movements, his careful, hungry way of eating, the terrible casual cruelty of a kick delivered over spilled wine. "How many other children?" she asked quietly. "At least 4 others, according to the records so far uncovered," Margaret said grimly. "Investigators are working to locate them now. Whether they remain in Lord Blackwood's household or whether they were sold onward to other buyers remains unclear." That evening, Eleanor found Duke Ashcombe alone in his study once more, staring at a stack of papers spread across his desk with an expression of barely restrained fury. She hesitated in the doorway, uncertain whether to intrude, but he glanced up and waved her inside. "You have heard, I take it," he said, gesturing to the papers. "For other children, at minimum, purchased through the same broker who sold my son into that man's household. For other families somewhere in this province or beyond it who may still be searching, exactly as I searched without ever knowing where to look." "What will you do?" Eleanor asked, settling into the chair across from him. "Everything within my power," the Duke said firmly. "I have already sent word to the magistrate demanding a full public hearing, not merely regarding your altercation with Lord Blackwood, but regarding the full scope of his conduct. I want the broker identified and arrested. I want every child he sold accounted for and returned to their families, if their families can be found. And I want it done publicly, so that other men who might consider such arrangements understand precisely what awaits them if they are discovered." Eleanor nodded slowly, admiring the steel beneath the Duke's careful, measured words. "And Lord Blackwood himself, what becomes of him?" "That," the Duke said, a hard edge entering his voice, "will be for the magistrate and the full council to decide, though I intend to make my own position on the matter very clear before the hearing begins. A man who mistreats a child in his care, regardless of that child's birth, has forfeited any claim to the protections his title once afforded him." The hearing was set to take place 5 days later, in the grand hall of the city courthouse, before the magistrate and a full council of provincial lords. Word of the coming spectacle spread through the city like wildfire, whispered in market stalls and taverns alike, each retelling growing more dramatic than the last. By the time the appointed morning arrived, the courthouse steps were crowded with onlookers hoping for a glimpse of the proceedings, though only a select few were permitted inside. Eleanor sat near the front of the hall, Edwin beside her, his small hand gripping hers tightly beneath the folds of her borrowed dress. Duke Ashcombe sat a short distance away, dressed in the formal robes of his office for the first time since Eleanor had met him, every inch the powerful nobleman he had carefully avoided appearing to be during their private conversations. Lord Blackwood entered the hall flanked by 2 attendants, his expression a careful mask of wounded innocence, though Eleanor noticed the way his eyes darted nervously toward the gathered council members, searching for allies who did not appear to be present. Word of the accusations against him had clearly already reached every corner of the city, and few, it seemed, were eager to be associated with his defense. The magistrate, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for unflinching fairness, called the hearing to order with a single sharp rap of her gavel. "We are gathered," she announced, her voice carrying easily across the hushed hall, "to determine the truth of several serious matters. First, an assault committed by one Eleanor Hart against Lord Edmund Blackwood in the public market square. Second, and of far greater consequence, allegations regarding Lord Blackwood's treatment of a child in his household, and the manner in which that child came to be there." Lord Blackwood rose immediately, his voice ringing with practiced indignation. "Magistrate, I fail to see how a servant dispute merits the full attention of this council. The woman struck me without provocation, and I demand she be punished according to the law." "Without provocation," the magistrate repeated dryly, glancing down at a stack of papers before her. I have here 3 separate witness accounts from the market square, all confirming that you struck a child repeatedly before Miss Hart intervened. Would you care to dispute their accuracy?" A ripple of murmurs passed through the gathered crowd, and Lord Blackwood's confident posture faltered slightly. "The boy was clumsy," he said stiffly. "A servant's error deserves correction." "Correction," the magistrate said, her voice growing colder, "is not the word most would use to describe repeated blows delivered to a child for the crime of tripping. But let us set that matter aside briefly, and turn instead to a more pressing question. Lord Blackwood, can you explain to this council how the boy in question came to be employed within your household?" Lord Blackwood's composure cracked further, a thin sheen of sweat becoming visible on his brow despite the cool morning air within the hall. "He was placed with me through a proper broker, as many households acquire staff. I had no reason to question the arrangement." "A proper broker," the magistrate said, lifting a document from the stack before her. "This is a record of payment bearing your seal, made to a man named Silas Vane, dated 7 years ago, for the acquisition of 5 children, described in this ledger not as staff placements, but as merchandise. Would you care to explain the discrepancy?" The hall erupted into murmurs once more, and this time Lord Blackwood said nothing at all, his face draining of color as the full weight of the evidence settled over the gathered crowd. Duke Ashcombe rose slowly from his seat, and the hall fell silent once more, every eye turning toward him. "Magistrate," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident beneath it, "I believe it is time this council learned the full truth of who that child is." The magistrate nodded, gesturing for him to continue, and the Duke turned to face the gathered crowd, one hand resting gently on Edwin's shoulder as the boy stood beside him, small and pale but no longer trembling. "7 years ago," the Duke began, "my infant son was stolen from my household during a violent raid that left 3 of my guards wounded. We searched for him tirelessly, without success, until 3 days ago, when a woman in this very hall struck a nobleman for kicking a servant boy in the public market. That boy, as confirmed by our household physician and by a birthmark carried through 6 generations of my family, is my son. His name is Edwin Ashcombe, and he has spent the last 7 years of his life as an unpaid, mistreated servant in the household of the very man now standing before this council." A stunned silence swept through the hall, so complete that Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then, all at once, the silence broke into a wave of gasps and murmurs, council members turning to whisper urgently to one another, onlookers craning their necks for a better view of the pale, quiet boy standing beside the Duke. Lord Blackwood's face had gone the color of ash. "That is impossible," he stammered, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "The boy was simply a servant. I had no knowledge of his true identity." "Whether or not you knew," the magistrate said sharply, "does not excuse the manner in which you treated a child in your care, nor the fact that you knowingly purchased children through a broker dealing in stolen and sold youth. Ignorance of his lineage is not a defense against cruelty, Lord Blackwood, and it certainly is not a defense against the far more serious charge of trafficking in children." The Duke stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall. "I do not ask this council to punish Lord Blackwood for failing to recognize my son. I ask this council to hold him accountable for the bruises on that boy's ribs, for the years of hunger and mistreatment he suffered, and for the 4 other children still unaccounted for, purchased through the same broker and never seen again by families who may still be searching for them, exactly as I searched for my own son." A council member near the front of the hall rose slowly, an older lord with a stern, weathered face. "Your Grace," he said, "the council will need time to properly investigate the full scope of these allegations. But I speak, I believe, for the majority present when I say that the evidence already before us is damning enough to warrant Lord Blackwood's immediate suspension from all noble privileges, pending a full and thorough inquiry." A chorus of agreement rippled through the assembled council members, and Lord Blackwood, sensing the tide turning irreversibly against him, sank back into his seat, his earlier bluster replaced entirely by a hollow, defeated silence. The magistrate rapped her gavel once more, restoring order to the murmuring hall. This council finds sufficient cause to proceed with a full inquiry into Lord Blackwood's conduct, including his involvement with the broker known as Sela's Vane, and the fate of the 4 additional children purchased through that arrangement. Until that inquiry is complete, Lord Blackwood is stripped of his noble privileges and placed under formal watch. As for the matter of Eleanor Hart's conduct in the market square, given the circumstances now revealed to this council, I find no grounds for punishment. If anything, this council owes her a debt of gratitude for the courage she displayed in defending a child who could not yet defend himself. Applause broke out among the onlookers, hesitant at first, then growing steadily louder, until the grand hall echoed with the sound of a city expressing, for once, unified approval. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, unaccustomed to such open attention, but beside her, Edwin squeezed her hand tightly, a small, proud smile breaking across his face for the first time since she had met him. In the weeks that followed, the full truth of Lord Blackwood's dealings with the broker Sela's Vane came to light, piece by painful piece. Investigators tracked down 2 of the 4 missing children, both found working in a distant textile mill under conditions barely better than those Edwin had endured. Their families, when located, wept with a relief so profound it left even the hardened investigators moved to silence. The other 2 children remained unaccounted for, though the Duke pledged publicly that the search for them would continue for as long as it took, funded personally from his own household resources. Sela's Vane himself was apprehended trying to flee the province by ship, his ledgers seized and used as evidence not only against Lord Blackwood, but against several other households across the region who had unknowingly, or in some cases knowingly, purchased children through his network. The scandal rippled far beyond the borders of the city, prompting new laws regarding the placement and treatment of household staff, laws that Duke Ashcombe himself championed before the full provincial council in the months that followed. Lord Blackwood, stripped of his title and his lands, was ultimately sentenced to a lengthy term of labor within the very mills where children like Edwin had once toiled without pay or protection, a fitting irony that few in the city failed to notice. His fall from grace became a cautionary tale told throughout the province, a warning to any nobleman who might consider treating those beneath him with casual, careless cruelty. For Eleanor, life settled into a rhythm she could never have imagined in the days before the market square. Duke Ashcombe, deeply grateful for her role in Edwin's return, offered her a permanent position within his household as the boy's companion and caretaker, a role Edwin himself requested with quiet insistence the moment he learned it was being considered. "I do not trust many people," he told her one evening, sitting beside her in the estate's garden as the sun set behind the distant hills. "But I trust you. You did not know who I was when you helped me. You only saw that I needed help." "That is all that ever mattered," Eleanor said gently, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Titles and bloodlines do not determine who deserves kindness, Edwin. Everyone does." Over the months that followed, Eleanor watched Edwin slowly transform from the guarded, frightened child she had first met into a boy who laughed more easily, who asked questions with genuine curiosity rather than careful caution, who began to trust the household staff around him, one small step at a time. She taught him to read more fluently, spent long afternoons walking with him through the estate gardens, and gradually became not merely his caretaker, but something closer to family, a steady presence in a life that had been anything but steady for far too long. Duke Ashcombe, too, changed in ways Eleanor found herself quietly noticing. The perpetual weariness that had marked his face during their first meeting slowly eased, replaced by a lightness she suspected had been absent from his household for the entire 7 years of his son's absence. He began joining Eleanor and Edwin on their garden walks more frequently, and the careful, formal distance he had initially maintained toward Eleanor gradually softened into something warmer, something neither of them quite named aloud, though the household staff began exchanging knowing glances whenever the 3 of them were seen together. A year after the hearing that had upended so many lives, the province gathered once more, though this time for a celebration rather than a trial. Duke Ashcombe formally and publicly presented Edwin as his heir before the full provincial council, a ceremony marked by relief and genuine joy rather than the tension and uncertainty that had defined their earlier public appearance together. Edwin, dressed in fine clothes that no longer hung awkwardly from his gradually strengthening frame, stood tall beside his father. The pendant that had once been his only connection to his true identity now displayed openly around his neck, a symbol of survival rather than secrecy. Elinor stood nearby throughout the ceremony, watching with quiet pride as the boy she had defended without knowing his name now stepped fully into the life that had always been meant for him. When the formal proceedings concluded, and the crowd began to disperse into the gardens for the celebration that followed, Duke Ashcombe found his way to her side, his expression uncharacteristically nervous for a man who governed an entire province with steady confidence. "Elinor," he said, and something in the way he spoke her name, quiet and careful, made her heart quicken unexpectedly. "I have thought a great deal this past year about what your courage in that market square truly gave me. Not merely my son returned, though that alone would have earned my eternal gratitude, but something else as well. A household that laughs again, a boy who trusts the world enough to hope for good things from it. And if I am honest, a companionship I did not realize I had been missing until you brought it into this house." Elinor felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertain how to respond to words so unexpectedly tender from a man she had come to respect so deeply over the past year. "I only did what I believed was right," she said softly. "I never expected any of this in return." "I know," the Duke said, a genuine smile breaking across his face, the same smile Elinor had grown to treasure over their many quiet evenings together. "That is precisely why it means so much." Nearby, Edwin watched the exchange with a knowing grin far too perceptive for a boy his age, one hand resting lightly on the pendant at his throat. The same pendant that had once marked him as an unknown servant, and now marked him as a beloved son finally, fully, restored to the family and the future that had always been waiting for him. The garden filled with warm evening light, laughter drifting between the trees, and Elinor Hart, once simply a seamstress with a fierce sense of justice, found herself standing at the center of a family she had helped create through nothing more than a single, fearless act of kindness. She had not known, on that ordinary afternoon in the crowded market square, that her hand meeting Lord Blackwood's cheek would set into motion a chain of events reshaping so many lives. She had known only that a child was suffering, and that she could not stand by and watch it happen. Sometimes, she thought, watching Edwin race across the garden lawn with a freedom he had never before known, that was all it took to change the entire course of a story. One person refusing to look away.